everybody. Thank you for the last session. I know it's quick back into the next session. Before I introduce our moderator for this talk, if you missed the last session, just a recap of what's going to happen now. We have our phenomenal panelists that are going to talk for about 40 minutes. Then we will do another salon session. So you'll go back to the tables you were in last time, have a discussion, and then we'll recap. So I will now hand it over to Brandon. Are you here? Yes, you are. So speakers for this panel, feel free to turn on your camera, and I will hand it over to Brandon.
Hello, and thank you, Hillary, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone, to the Now What panel, where the conversation is focused on systems and practices for diverse talent, retention, and growth. I'm Brandon Williams. I'll be your moderator for today, and the panel assembled represents varying experiences in the entertainment and media industry. Hopefully you were able to attend beyond the checkbox discussion prior to this, which was amazing, and started to dive into some of the solutions. We hope that this reInvent panel continues to spark discussions, new thoughts, and inspire action that can be taken immediately after this session. I hope that we hear examples of what's worked and what hasn't worked, and the why and why not. So hopefully today we'll have an engaging panel. With us, we have Morenike Dosu, Senior Department Manager of DreamWorks Animation. Madeline Donono is the CEO of the Gina Davis Institute on Gender in Media. We have Jay Francis, VP of Current Series and Diversity at Disney Television Animation. And somewhere, I hope she's going to pop on camera, is Maria Banji as Executive Director of Harness. Before we dive in, I would like for each of you to briefly introduce yourselves. And if we could start with Morenike.
Absolutely. Hi, thanks for the introduction. So my name is Morenike Dosu. I am a Senior Department Manager at DreamWorks Animation. I've been there for a few years now. It feels like a few decades. That's my running joke, but it really does seem that way. I look after some of our back-end departments, so a lot of our artists for lighting, Digimat, 2D Comp, image finaling department. I'm also one of our co-leads for our Black Employee Network and Employee Resource Group, so I'm sure that's something that we'll probably talk about a little bit later on in this panel.
Great. Thank you, Morenike. Madeline, would you like to go next?
Thank you, Brandon. Hi, everybody. I have the privilege of serving as the president and CEO for the Gina Davis Institute on Gender and Media. And essentially, we're a data-driven think tank. We work mostly as a B2B with all of you who are all trying to do great work when it comes to, D&I. And we have a lot of research tools that are being used, and I'm sure we'll get into that later.
Definitely, we definitely will. I'm excited about that piece of it. Thank you and welcome. Jay, I'll hand it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Everyone good? All right. Jay Francis, VP of Series and Diversity at Disney Television Animation. I've been at Disney for almost 14 years now, which is just amazing to me because typically my stops have been 5 years and out, 5 years and out. So, I've done both development and current series work at TV Animation. 3 years ago, I expanded my role into our DEI work. So I still do a little bit of current series. I still do a little bit of development, but most of my focus now is on our DEI work, and I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. We're happy to have you, Jay. And Maria.
Hi, everybody. My name is Maria. I'm the Executive Director of Harness. Harness is an organization that was founded by leaders from Hollywood, specifically America Ferrera, Wilmer Valderrama, and Ryan Pierce Williams. And we built a community of intersectional artists and leading activists and industry leaders who work together to co-create a more just world for all of us. And we incubate different projects for that, including storytelling around Indigenous communities, Black liberation, undocumented families, etc. And we do some industry-facing work where we bring the leaders that we work with into studios and networks to talk about how to represent their stories and communities most authentically. So excited to be here.
Great. again, varying experiences. I hope today that we can just have a real conversation, dive deep, share examples, and really have some actionable takeaways. Maria, I actually want to start with you. And your work and background has also focused on building communities, increasing access for underrepresented groups. You've done a lot of work. You talk about the power of storytelling and also imagining a different future. So through your work, you've seen where systems and practices have been built that historically failed or put historically marginalized groups at a disadvantage, right? You've done that work. You've been a community organizer. You've been in it. I want to start by you sharing a bit about the importance and power of examining systems and practices while we dive deep into this.
Absolutely. I mean, storytelling first, like what I feel like this is something that is so endemic to the DNA of this audience, right? We know that stories are kind of essential human technology. They're the ways that we make meaning of ourselves and of the world around us. And oftentimes stories actually inform the systems that then come into place, right? And so sometimes when we're in the business of making culture, we don't actually interrogate the culture within our own organizations. And we don't understand like the stories that we're telling that actually give power to some and disenfranchise others. And I think that just as we're trying to tell different stories in front of the camera, we also have to really interrogate and understand what are the stories that we tell ourselves behind the camera, right? And Hollywood as an industry is in a tremendous moment of transition, just like the world is in a tremendous moment of transition. And one of the things that we have to start to do is really interrogate what are the assumptions that we make, right, about what is successful, who can do what job, why is it that somebody is qualified and somebody else isn't, and how do we really encourage ourselves to understand what might be tradition and what is actually a requirement, right? And that sometimes the things that we consider just the way that things need to be is actually acting as a barrier to diversity and to different people having access. So for me, when we're talking about storytelling and creating culture, the tremendous possibilities of imagining a new future mean like the type of stories that we're telling the world should help us imagine a world that is actually authentic to the world that we live in, and actually can also give us a vision of what does true representation and equality and justice look like. But I also think it includes doing interrogation in our own culture and in the stories we tell ourselves day to day within our companies.
I love that, and you know, I like that you call it interrogation, right? It's just a way. It's a way of examining. Like we really should look inwardly just as much as we look outwardly, and everything that's impacting the world impacts organizations. We don't leave identities or experiences at the door, or now in this particular case, you know, before we get on a video call, we don't turn it off and then go into work. It's all one and the same. Thank you for sharing that, and I do want to continue to unpack that throughout the conversation. Madeline, your work really big on research and data and leveraging that space to help shape the stories, shape the why in measurements. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've seen data in the research really inform decision making?
Absolutely. We've been studying two things: who's showing up and how are they showing up since 2004. But as we have been in service of all of you as creators and your demand to operationalize how you look at D&I from a content strategy standpoint, whereas 10 years ago it was really about workplace and hiring. And so with that, we've customized a lot of our research tools from a pre-production or post-production standpoint. And with our spell check for bias tool, which we're so proud to have the Walt Disney Company and NBC Universal as our pilot partners, you know, we're able to do a D&I assessment with science and data and present that allows, it bridges a conversation between the D&I executives or the chief diversity officers along with the creatives. Because sometimes those conversations can be emotional. And so this is just diffuses all of that. And it's a way for people to kind of put their eyes on it. So for example, most storytellers are going to really focus on their lead protagonist, right? But when you think about how do you infuse D&I on screen, you really want to look at every character that's contributing and speaking. And lots of times those people aren't even described at all in scripted material. And that presents a lot of opportunities to infuse diversity, and inclusion. And so it's been, the feedback that we've received has been very, very positive. And again, you all have to move fast. So whatever systems you're going to adapt into the development process has to move as fast as you all are with your, green light process. So that's what's been, it appears to be really, helping.
Thank you. Madeline, you just touched on it. So spell check for bias, for those who are familiar, is a tool.
That's correct. It's a hybrid tool that uses AI and human expert coding.
And have you seen where that same AI concept, because I can throw out some companies as well, but I don't want to just throw out names of companies, but how have you seen AI in general help the workforce as well? Like, how can people think about different ways to leverage tools to navigate, inclusion in the workplace? Like, the people are already there, right? So this conversation here is about retention of the talent once we have them, right? So the now what? How are there ways to use tools or AI? And I'll open this up to anyone, tools or AI to help with the workforce.
So one thing I'll just say, and then let everybody else speak, is that I think what everyone in the AI ecosystem has learned is that it doesn't function independently without human intervention, human annotation, because AI can be fraught with unconscious bias as well. So that's why for us, we use the AI for certain things, but then we use a human expert, coders, for other things. So that's, I'll just say that and let other people jump in.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm curious, has anyone specifically leveraged, I don't want to name out companies, but in terms of having difficult conversations, we find that leaders may struggle with that. The practice, how do I get it started? I don't know what to say to someone, or they've approached a situation and I don't know where to start, that uncomfortable piece. There are some tools out there as well for people to have a safe space to practice conversations using tools. Has anyone seen where that's worked or not worked? Maria.
Yeah, definitely. I was thinking of a couple different examples. I was talking to an executive at Disney recently who was struggling with figuring out how to help somebody understand why a decision they were making wasn't the right one when it came to representation. And I talked to her about the importance of explaining the implications. Like, what are the consequences of that decision? And sometimes when we're having conversations, we tend to focus on like the values, right? Rather than the actual like implications of when a decision is made. And something as simple as like just outlining out, like, when you make this decision, this is what happens and this is the result. It unlocks something for that executive, and they were able to go back and have that conversation. The other thing I was thinking about is, like, we've done a training before with the D&I group at Netflix around the power of their own personal stories. So there's a really incredible model by Dr. Marshall Gans, who is at Harvard. He's a community organizer. He actually was the one that helped architect Obama's story of self in his first presidential run, right? And it's very, very successful. And so we adopted the story of self model for employees at an entertainment industry to be able to understand how they could tap into their own personal stories and use that to socialize concepts around diversity and inclusion and further that conversation within their own company. And I think there is something about bringing in your own personal experience, which can feel very vulnerable, but practicing that with others, right? And so maybe getting a coworker, and this is what we did at Netflix, is getting a coworker and sitting down with them and sharing your personal story and helping to understand how is it that we can use that to tie it into something that we're struggling with in the company, and explaining again, like, the stakes and why this is important. So those are some of the examples that came to mind.
I love that. In tying the personal story to honestly just your personal life. So, for example, I talk about the books that I'm reading regularly. I find ways to bring it up in conversation, right? To kickstart hey, I'm reading this book, really good book. I give you some cliff notes, if you will, but it also encourages dialogue around that. And so it's finding ways to really weave it into everyday conversations and getting comfortable a bit with identity and talking about it. I love that, Maria, and I believe that's an easy takeaway that people can go back and quickly implement. Jay, I want to turn it to you. When we talked previously, you got into a bit of the strategy pieces of it. And sometimes people don't know where to start when it comes to retention and thinking about development. What would you say are some procedures that people should consider when looking at companies?
Yeah, well, one of the first things that I think we sort of chatted about this earlier, is before you can even get into that, there has to be commitment and intentionality to this whole idea of talent retention and diverse hiring and what have you. It can't just be lip service, right? Oftentimes you hear the word, "Oh, we would love to hire X diverse candidate, but can't find quality people," which has never really been true at all. But if you really truly work, if you're looking at it from that lens, then we need to sort of look at different ways and strategies. You need to reevaluate the position. If somebody's doesn't have the experience you want, then maybe you need to bring two people in to gain that experience. And then in that sense, now all of a sudden you're training two people at the same time, both of them bringing the needed experience to the position, right? So it's a rethinking of your strategy around who you're trying to hire. Again, if you're truly intentional and you're truly committed to this, you're looking at different ways to get the desired result versus the sort of either a legacy type of, this is what we've always done, this is how we've always looked at this position. Or maybe you need to stretch your budget and schedule. Again, if you're committed to this, then the reality is you are looking for different ways. Maybe you have to start your show later to continue your search. Maybe you need to look at different places in terms of where you are actually looking for the folks that you're trying to bring in. So I think there's sort of certain things like that we need to look at. I also think, obviously, in terms of the ideas, and I think we've been talking about this a little bit in terms of mentorship and advocate programs for folks who are already in, and to provide guidance and build additional relationships for people within the company, so that these conversations that we've talked about don't always start from a completely awkward or challenging point, that you've had consistent conversations. So when something comes up, it's not like, oh, how do I bring this up now? You have already had conversations with people and there's been a more openness to it. So now it's just like, it's more like a, hey, you got a second? Want to throw something at you because here's what just happened. And there is that sort of recognition that you now have, for lack of a better term, permission on both sides to have these conversations, so that it doesn't feel so, what can I say, and how this is going to impact my job, or the comfortability that I have within my workplace. I think we all have to understand, and while maybe not embrace, but accept the fact that we have to get uncomfortable first in this work before we can get comfortable. And I think, last summer started that process. And I think while there's still a lot more work to do on this, I think that these, at least from my perspective, these conversations are coming a bit easier.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I want to sit in this space for a bit, because oftentimes what the challenge comes with is, what's the process? How do I get started? Where do I look, right? So we're talking about a lot of concepts here, but when we think of systems and we think of practices within organizations, you can boil the ocean. Let's talk specifically around what is a system or a practice that should be looked at within the organization, and what does that process look like? Jay, I was kind of continuing with you. Oh, Nikkei.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Nikkei's ready. Go ahead, Nikkei.
Yeah, go
Please.
for it.
No, I was going to jump in on kind of the whole grassroots sort of level of it about a system or a practice or a community that organizations can look into. And again, I'm going to go back to the employee resource groups, those affinity groups. At my company at DreamWorks, we recently launched them, and it just happened that it launched right before last summer. And in that space of having that affinity group, of having those ERGs, we realized a couple of things. One, if you're talking about building relationships, right, that's a great space to build relationships so that you can start having those open dialogues, that you can start, getting past that, what you said, the awkward stage, so that you can be comfortable in being uncomfortable and then get back to being comfortable. Because you've already had those relationships, because you're a member of that ERG. And of course, when we're talking about ERGs, we're not just talking about people of that one identity. The whole point is to bring in an inclusive space, so also allies and people who want to support that identity should be a part of these ERGs. So when I think about a practice that a company can put into place that's really quite tangible, I would encourage folks to look at, perhaps maybe, if you don't have an ERG, create an ERG or have that outlet. I would also say that we can provide budgets to help support the ERGs as well, in terms of some of their programming or some of their initiatives that they want. I'm very fortunate that our company does that. We have a budget to help, and we also have great partnerships through that ERG to some of the structures that are already in place, so that when we think about bringing in an amazing speaker or a panelist, if I don't personally have the budget through my ERG to pay for that exposure, I can reach out to our studio who has a budget, or I can reach out to an executive who's a part of this ERG who wants to support these groups and that voice of that community, and ask them to help us identify how to execute on whatever initiative or budget that we need. That's why I was quick to unmute, because I think I want to speak to that.
Can we stay on that a bit, Nikkei? So just diving into, you ended by saying businesses leaning into the groups and leveraging them. Let's talk a bit about that. What does that look like? How can leaders, organizations lean into the specific ERGs, tie it back to a meaningful work experience, and not just an organization or a club, if you will, that sits to the side? How can organizations lean into this?
I think so. From my experience, or what I would recommend is, get into it. You want to lean into it, get into it, right? You want to support, like I said, looking at budgets, providing an actual budget to help support some of the programming or the execution of it. If there's data there that you want to necessarily, understand a little bit more about why that data is what it is, why are those, that retention, we're talking about retention right here, right? This panel is about retention. So if you want to have that group of individuals that you want to ask, okay, so why are you either staying, or as people are leaving, why are you leaving? This can be a place for communication where you can leverage the ERGs to have those conversations, to unpack a little bit more about the data. Let's say you want to, we make content. Content is king, right? So we want to make content. You have a group of people who are passionate in your organization already about supporting those voices, or that come from that voice. Look to that group to provide a space to comment on the content. Sorry, Jay.
No, you took it. That's exactly where I was going to next, because when we tying it to retention, it's one thing to have these organizations, but to not utilize them and not sort of, pull from them. So right to your point, I mean, what we try to do is, yeah, they are to a certain degree these groups and quote unquote clubs, but how you utilize them is, I think, as important. So, for example, using that reference, you know, we will go to our groups and say, hey, can you guys look at this design and tell us what you think about it? And these are people, and you know, a lot of people who are not in specifically the content part of the business, right? But now they feel like we're being asked, we're being connected to the content as Nikki referenced, and like all of a sudden there's a different morale, there's a different sort of momentum to the work that they're doing here. They now feel more a part of the overall strategy and the business side, which makes them feel better about what they're doing and included. And that's where that sort of retention comes in. It's just like, you know, all of a sudden it's just like, oh, I'm thought of more than just I'm an accountant over here, and all they want from me are this. No, we want we want to utilize. It makes just good sense all around to utilize what we call think tanks. Actually, that's what we sort of look at them and call them think tanks, because that's exactly what they are. You have this group of very passionate people. Let's we talked about leaning in, right? Like really lean in and get some real information from them that might be blocked from the creative side. It was just like we're in the weeds, right? We're doing. It's just like, hey, we'll get a different perspective and because this is also your audience too. So they represent a side that could like really provide some insight that we as the creative side may not be thinking about.
Love that. Oftentimes you see organizations go externally for focus groups when you have a team of people, a think tank that are there and readily available for that focus group to give feedback and input. So I would recommend find ways to lean into the groups versus the groups, having to lean into the business. It should go the other way. At all levels, I would say representation is important. And I want to go to Madeline on this one. So when you think about representation and the work that you've done more on screen and with your work, that translates into the organizations in people being able to see themselves, being able to know that that is achievable. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of representation?
Absolutely. So like I said earlier, it's one thing to say who's showing up, but how are they showing up? And we have seen direct correlations with what has played out in the fictional world playing out in the real world. So this is, a unique example. Some of you may know that Gina tried out for the Olympics back in the day, in archery, and her archery coach approached us a few years ago and said, hey, girls' participation in archery shot up 105% in 2012. And guess what? The two movies that singularly drove that increase, it was Your Own Brave and Hunger Games. So girls saw those movies in the theater and immediately went out and bought a bow. Another example, on the more serious side is with STEM. We had the privilege of doing a study for 20th Century and the X-Files, and we were able to show a connection between the portrayal of the Scully, they called it the Scully effect, played by the amazing Gillian Anderson, on women and girls in STEM. 63% of the women and girls working in STEM now are doing so because of her, because they saw her. And it goes on and on and on. So even though it's make-believe, when, our children can see characters, diverse characters doing unique things as careers, it can really open up a world for them in terms of aspirations for leadership or other types of careers.
Definitely. I want to tie into a question that came up in the chat. Mario, I'm going to throw this to you, and I think you have some really good perspective here on this. When we think about whether it's just, if we think about ERGs and people willing to have the conversations and how do they lean in there, but also anyone within the organization who may not want to have the conversation. You've worked with leaders across the studios to have uncomfortable conversations, to think differently. What's your recommendation on employees, again, day-to-day action, whether it's in an ERG or day-to-day, how do we have the conversation with people who aren't leaning in, who aren't, raising their hand? How do we get there?
A really hard question, Brandon, because it really differs based on who the person is, right? And like what sometimes, it's been interesting to me. Some of the most challenging conversations that I've been a part of are people who are from a marginalized background and who have had to hide that background to be successful in Hollywood. And so because of that, for some of it, it almost feels like therapy sometimes, where you're just like opening space for people to be able to say like, this is my lived experience. And I, had to hide this part of myself for so long or deny this part of myself for so long, right? And so because of that, I don't want to be in conversation with somebody else about it. And to like provide a space and an opening for people to be able to actually have those conversations and to start to like access that part of themselves. I actually think that's been one of the big challenges we've dealt with. In addition to that, I think it's a conversation about how can you approach it from a place of connection and talking about implications? Like, what does this actually mean? And there's some really great resources out there around how to have a difficult conversation, right? Where you can ensure that the way that you're talking is about us and it's not about you are doing this, right? And kind of like making it feel like it becomes adversarial, which is hard because if you're an employee and there's a power dynamic, then it's just even more challenging to actually have that conversation. But if you can figure out a way to approach it where you're saying to the person like, look, like this is my experience. This is how I'm understanding this. This is why this is important to me. And I'd like to welcome you into this conversation with me, into this work with me. I think just trying to lower, the thing that is the reality about a lot of this work is that there's real emotional like undercurrents. And until we recognize and acknowledge them and make space for them in the conversations, it's really hard. And it's hard on both sides, right? And so it's a hard answer, Brandon, because I feel like it is very much like it goes individual by individual,
Great. I love that. And thank you for acknowledging that. I think of the concept of nonprofits. We can learn so much from other industries, but you think about nonprofits who may serve, underrepresented communities, if you will. And when you have new board members, you gotta take them through a level setting of you need to understand the people you're serving, right? And whether there's a training or you talk about empathy, you really have to learn and go through your own journey and reflection to be able to best engage with others in an empathetic way. I think that is a good practice. I think it is something organizations should look at. Again, if we're gonna create this environment, it's everyone's role. Have you all seen examples where, we've learned from either, the nonprofit sector or other like true examples that organizations can think about to change the environment? Anyone can jump in on this.
Well, I will just say that it's interesting that, and again, starting with last summer's events and the social unrest, this was new for a whole lot of people. And so I'm going to be honest with you and sort of answering that question. Working in this space, where most of my priority was sort of talent outreach. And all of a sudden we were now refocusing our attention on the folks who are already here, right? Who now not only had to share, as you've sort of recognized, the emotionality of all this stuff on the outside, but then opening that up to, so now let me analyze what's been going on with me here and sharing that and becoming very sort of real about that type of thing. So, I will just speak for myself. Truth be told, I haven't had a moment's rest in terms of analyzing other areas. It's just been like, because I'm learning on this journey as well, someone like me is put in this position of, on the one hand, as a Black man, like I am reacting emotionally to everything that's happening around me on the outside, and for the safety of my kids, my wife, for my own personal sort of thing. But I am in a position where I'm also looked at the company as the leader. So people are coming to me. It's just like, and looking for some leadership from me. And this is where the challenge comes in, because you have senior leaders who are looking at you saying, help guide us here, right? And be honest to us. We want your honesty. Okay, I'm happy to do that, but also understand what comes with that, because oftentimes you're found, at least at where I'm at, I'm oftentimes, and I'm sure other people can relate to this, you're the only Black person in a room. You've been the only Black person in meetings for years. You've learned to a certain degree how to compartmentalize that. And now you're sort of being asked to sort of flip the switch here in terms of, for lack of a better term, representing the whole Black race. And it's just like, I can't really do that because the Black race isn't monolithic the way no one else is monolithic. It's just like, I have an opinion on these things, and you have to take that at face value. I can't say I'm going to speak for anybody except myself, but understand I'm experiencing the way that most people, again, referencing the summer and what we were going through, what most Black people were going through at that particular time. So for me specifically, it was a juggling act. Like some days where I had to sort of be in this, what I call this jackpot of like, okay, I have to hold in my emotions right now because I'm sort of dealing with the issue on this level, but my insides are also tearing up because I'm looking at this, and the pain that I'm seeing as a Black man in this country is very visceral and very out there. And so it's trying to find that balance. So I don't know how satisfying an answer that is, because what I'm saying is I don't know how the other folks do it, because we are still in learning mode as we speak right now. We are still in the middle of the storm. And I feel like, I think what my job more or less now is to remind people that there's still an urgency to all of this, that even though CNN may not be broadcasting protests anymore, doesn't mean they're not happening anymore. And there were promises made last summer, and I'm here to remind you of those promises, and we got to keep this thing going. So that's sort of the focus in terms of where I come at this situation. And it's hard. It really is challenging and difficult.
Yes, Mari, please.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. Jay, you're so right. And I think this burden of representation, they talk about, like, as a person of color, and especially as a Black person, like how you are then expected now to save the company and to be a leader, and you're dealing with like all of the kind of like tumult of like what's even going on. I think it's important to say to the leaders that are here, right, that can be allies, to say, like, don't expect your employees of color to like provide all of the leadership and guidance, because they're also dealing with the personal ramifications of the social situations that we're as a country and as a world we're grappling with, right? And so how is it that you can actually provide support and a space for processing or whatever might be necessary for employees that are dealing with this, right? And where can you like hear from them, but also not expect them to lead the work for you, right? Because then it just becomes like this additional burden of like you're wearing multiple hats, which is not fair. So
totally. And when we think about leadership, I'll add, I always tell my leaders the same way they go into a new role and they get up to speed on everything that's happened years prior. Somehow they're up to speed in like a few months, and they can tell you, oh, well, the numbers were this many years ago, or this happened, or it's because of this strategy we shifted. They can give you all the back history. They've done the work. They've invested. That same energy should be placed into this as a leader, of doing the work on your own and investing and doing the research as part of it to get up to speed. So that's another nugget that I'll say, like, you have to do the work. And as Jay was saying, the learning is continuous. We're all learning as we go through this. Marinika, you.
Yeah, I think I was, being kind of still with our ears to the ground, being a manager and still going back to that retention of our workforce at the moment. I think it actually speaks volume, though, to say, look, we are on this journey. We're going to release the data, or we're going to be open about it. We're moving towards it, right? but we don't have all the answers just yet. Here's the answers that we do have, or this is the space that we're doing it, and having those conversations again with that group that you're trying to retain. Like, come to if you don't. I saw in the chat someone mentioned that you don't have necessarily an ERG. Maybe make it an open forum or something along those lines, where you can start to have those conversations, and then follow through with those conversations. And then in part of that conversation, acknowledge that, look, you don't have to have all my answers for me. I'm just here to listen and create that space. Like was said, I think like I can speak in the first person, but it really did make an impact when it wasn't just a tweet that was sent out, but the company actually stopped and said, hey, let me actually support and give you space to process what's happening right now from an emotional level. Because like you said, we don't just stop bringing all that we are when we jump on a Zoom, or stop bringing all that we are as we walk through that door, and we acknowledge that, and we're going to hold space for that. And then from my point of view as a person in that workforce, then I'm like, okay, then this company really is a space for me to continue to grow, and they do value me here. So I think if we're talking about retention, we have to acknowledge that, follow through, yes, but also being able to speak to that is important as well.
So, Marinika, I want to stay with you for a minute, because in your role as a department manager, you are navigating the careers of individuals, right? On a day-to-day basis, you have people coming to you asking for guidance, what's next, and oftentimes there are retention conversations. I'm not asking you to share us what your entire strategy is, but if you could, just give us some, like, most companies create a retention strategy, and if they don't have one, there should be a strategy around different levers that can be pulled, and be intentional about a plan. Can you just give us some examples, whether it's a stay interview, or what are some things that organizations can use as you're navigating individual conversations regarding retention?
I think that's a very, I can give you a cookie cutter answer, but I think it's going to be unique based off of what your organization is, and where, again, going back to that data, where you find that you're missing out on that retention. Like the first thing you want to talk about if you're talking about retention strategies is being honest about the data, about where are you losing the retention at. Like if you're losing retention in a creative space, then perhaps it's about making sure to partner and go back to, like what Jay was saying earlier, about mentorships, or having those connections earlier on in the person's career, so that they can feel seen with their assignments, or they can also have a sponsor or an advocate in the room when those opportunities to elevate arise, right? So if you're talking about, again, I think in order to truly answer the retention strategy piece, you got to be honest about where you're losing out on the retention to begin with.
Definitely. Thank you for that. And when we think about individuals, I think there's an approach that we should often take, in every individual is different. Jay touched on it earlier. So when you're talking about retention, what people value, what's important, are different to different people. So sit with that, get to know, build connections, understand what's most important and valued from individuals, and we need to do more of that. Again, we don't leave ourselves at the door before going in. Before we run out of time, I do want to go around the room, because and ask every panelist this question. When we think about, a lot of companies may not be big companies on here with a lot of money. So what's kind of one big takeaway that you would say, walking out of this, here's an action that you should consider taking with your organization after this session today? Jay, you're ready. Go ahead.
I am ready. For me, the biggest part of all of this has been communication. And so I have been very active in making sure that I am sharing what is going on with me with people who I haven't necessarily connected with very strongly, or in key positions in which my work sort of flows through. So my takeaway to that is to set up half-hour meet and greets, conversations, and just say, hey, let's get to know each other a little bit better. I think these are the type of things that, because I think, I can't remember who said it, but these are comfortable on both sides, right? But especially for, for the diverse employees, it's incredibly difficult. So, I would say if oftentimes we get the question of how can I be an ally, well, for me, this is the way you can be an ally, is just to listen, So as someone who wants to be an ally, reach out to that population. For those who are on the other side, on the diverse side, don't be afraid to reach out either. I know that, you need to take the time to sort of make this right for you. But, ultimately, if your goal here is like, I'm struggling here at this company, but I'm not necessarily looking to leave. What I'm looking for is passive career growth, equity at the table. Let me try to find this before I make that larger decision that maybe this company is just not right for me, or maybe I need to shift the division I'm in. But I think you can only do that by having these conversations. And I know that's been sort of the through theme through all this in terms of these conversations, but I don't think you can get around it. I don't think there's any avoiding that, because that will set you and in your own mind in terms of like, do I have a future here or not? And that's what I think you need to come up with first before you can make any other sort of rational decisions about career growth.
Great. Thank you for that, Jay. Madeline.
Well, from what I've seen and kind of some of the practices that we use is being seen and being heard. So for example, how is the executive leadership recognizing talent? It could be a phone call, it could be an email. There should be a lot of high touch, kind of check-ins. I think among peers, I think it's great whether you're creative, marketing, tech, whatever, I think it's great to have peer-to-peer, recognition and recognizing something. We do something, and we're really, really small, but we do something where what's your best? What's your personal best? What happened this week that you're really proud of? And what's something that we're really proud of that you did to contribute to whatever it is? And it's sometimes it's the little things. It's the little, recognition for people to say, wow, I didn't notice that my peers or executives recognize that I contributed, X, Y, and Z. So again, that falls under communication, but I think, recognizing people for their contribution.
Yeah, that is a practice. What is your recognition practices within the company that maybe need to be revisited? What are the promotion practices, the talent conversation practices? Those things should all be looked at from a different lens. So thank you for that. Morinike.
Jump in with follow through. Follow through. All these are very key, like the communication, the recognition. If something came out of that communication, follow through. Perhaps, like you said, it might be something smaller or it might be something large. Well, at least follow through on the small things, because obviously action speaks so much louder than words. So people will notice if you are committing and following through, but also if you are not.
Thank you so much. And Maria.
I love that. I think all of these are so, this is a little bit more challenging, but if you can do it, it's so powerful. I believe in the power of experiential learning. So like not just talking about something, but actually going out and doing something together. I think that if you can actually curate experiences. So for example, one of the things that I know some of the executives that we've worked with have done, if they've gone to a Native American reservation and actually sat through a ceremony and had conversations. And, when you can, as a leader, curate a space for conversation where people have gotten out of a cubicle or an office, they've gone and they've had a shared experience, and now they can actually talk about it. It actually really helps to facilitate the type of conversations we're talking about. And so some of it actually, I know it's a little bit more difficult to do, but some of it is actually like let's go and get lunch at, like a local restaurant that has, obviously after COVID, but has some type of like social enterprise attached to it, or it has some relationship to a local community. How do I like start to break out of like just that like professional cubicle to like really starting to experience things together? I think that type of experience is what actually changes people's lives and gets people really connected to issues and to communities and gets them to understand the power that they have in making a difference. So.
Love that. Love that. Thank you. Thank you to all of the panelists. I feel like we can continue. I feel like we're just getting started now with many ideas. So thank you for the great recommendations and to everyone who joined. I'll now hand it back over to Hillary, who will explain the next steps.
Thank you, Brandon, and thank you all so much for an amazing conversation. Brandon did some work for all of the audience members by asking that last question, because that is the question that we will be asking you on the survey. So I put it in the chat. I'll put it in the chat again. So if you were in the last session, same thing's going to happen. I'm going to say present off. We're going to go back to the tables. Feel free to have a conversation about all the nuggets that came up in this conversation. If at least one person at each table can actually write in the form, that would be amazing, because we are going to collate all of the responses at the end of the day to send to all of you. So it would be really great to have some of it captured in the form. Panelists, feel free to join the conversations. And then when we come back for the recap, also feel free to turn back your cameras on so that we can discuss a little bit further. So we'll have 10 minutes for chatting and then a quick 5-minute recap when we come back. So thank you all again. And Brandon, wonderful moderation as usual.
Thank you, Brandon.